the city's rent board erupted into chaos after officials voted to advance proposed rent increases for rent-stabilized apartments, with hikes ranging from 0 to 2% for one-year leases and up to 4% for two-year leases. Protesters flooded the meeting halls, waving signs, chanting demands to freeze the rent completely, while frustrated tenants outside blasted city leaders for failing to deliver the promises they campaigned on. For many New Yorkers, this wasn't just another policy debate. It felt like the breaking point in a city where affordability keeps collapsing and every promise of relief seems to disappear the second elections are over. The anger pouring into the streets is becoming impossible to ignore. Thousands of residents who were told rents would stay frozen now feel betrayed as the cost of groceries, transportation, insurance, utilities, and healthcare continue to soar. People living on fixed incomes say nearly half their monthly earnings disappear into rent payments before they can even think about food or medicine. And while activists frame landlords as greedy profiteers, property owners claim they are drowning under crushing taxes, skyrocketing insurance costs, expensive repairs, and endless regulations that make keeping buildings operational nearly impossible.
The divide between tenants and landlords has become one of the most explosive political battles in the city. Protesters insist nobody should have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, while landlords warn that buildings cannot survive if rents stay frozen indefinitely. They argue that every year expenses rise while their income remains artificially capped, creating a system where maintenance is delayed, repairs are skipped, and entire buildings slowly decay because there simply is not enough money left to sustain them. What makes this fight even more intense is that both sides genuinely believe they are the victims. Renters see luxury towers rising across the skyline, while they struggle to survive in aging apartments. Meanwhile, small property owners claim they are being squeezed into bankruptcy by taxes and regulations they cannot control. The result is a city locked in economic warfare, where every political decision creates another group convinced it is being sacrificed for somebody else's agenda.
The mayor now finds himself trapped between the activist base that helped elect him and the economic reality confronting the housing market. During the campaign, voters were promised relief, lower living costs, and protections against displacement. But now those same voters are hearing discussions about rent increases, while their paychecks buy less every single month. To many residents, it feels like the promises of affordable living were never realistic in the first place. Behind all the shouting lies a problem far bigger than a 2% rent increase. The city simply does not have enough housing. Demand massively outweighs supply, and as long as construction remains restricted, prices continue climbing, regardless of political slogans. Critics argue that anti-development policies, endless permitting battles, and hostility toward private investment have created a housing shortage so severe that average apartments in some neighborhoods now cost more than entire homes in other parts of the country.
Economists have warned for years that restricting supply while increasing demand creates exactly this outcome. When new housing cannot be built fast enough, every available apartment becomes more valuable. Landlords gain leverage because tenants have fewer options, and people become trapped in unaffordable situations because there is nowhere else to go. Instead of solving the shortage, politicians often attempt to regulate prices directly, creating another layer of economic distortion that only deepens the crisis. Rent stabilization itself has become one of the most controversial issues in the entire debate. Supporters argue it protects working-class residents from being forced out of their neighborhoods by runaway prices. Opponents counter that artificially low rents discourage investment, reduce maintenance, and create incentives for landlords to remove apartments from the market entirely. In some cases, owners claim they lose money every month operating stabilized units because expenses rise far faster than the allowed rent increases.
As tensions rise, critics increasingly compare the current housing situation to what happened with the city's subway system decades ago. Transit fares were kept artificially low for years to satisfy political demands, but maintenance budgets were gutted in the process. Repairs were delayed, infrastructure deteriorated, and eventually the entire system required billions in emergency funding just to remain operational. Many fear the housing market is now heading down the exact same path. The comparison is difficult to ignore. When revenues fail to cover operating costs, systems begin collapsing,
slowly at first, and then all at once. Buildings age, repairs are postponed, plumbing fails, elevators break, roofs leak, and infrastructure crumbles because owners cannot afford the necessary upkeep. Eventually, the government steps in, demanding massive taxpayer-funded interventions to repair the damage created by years of underfunding.
Critics of the city's housing policies warn that freezing rents may provide temporary political relief while quietly accelerating long-term disaster. If landlords cannot sustain properties financially, they may stop investing in maintenance altogether or abandon the buildings entirely. Some may attempt to sell, others may convert properties, and many may simply leave the market if operating apartments no longer makes economic sense. That creates another dangerous consequence. As stabilized housing disappears or deteriorates, the remaining free market apartments become even more expensive because supply shrinks further. Instead of making housing affordable, opponents argue these policies ultimately reduce the number of available homes and drive prices even higher for everyone else. In other words, attempting to suppress prices through regulation may actually intensify the very crisis politicians claim they are solving. At the same time, tenants facing impossible financial pressure argue they cannot survive without protection. Residents describe spending 40% or more of their income on rent, while medical bills, transportation costs, and food prices continue climbing relentlessly. For people already struggling paycheck to paycheck, even a small increase feels catastrophic. Many insist the city has a moral obligation to shield vulnerable residents from displacement, regardless of what landlords or economists argue. The political atmosphere surrounding the issue has become deeply ideological. Supporters of stronger government intervention believe housing should function as a guaranteed right, rather than a commodity driven entirely by market forces. Opponents view the growing hostility toward landlords, developers, and businesses as part of a broader movement against capitalism itself. Each side increasingly sees the other not merely as wrong, but as fundamentally dangerous to the future of the city. Business leaders and wealthy investors are now openly discussing the possibility of relocating operations elsewhere if conditions worsen. Some argue that aggressive taxes, rising crime, anti-business rhetoric, and constant regulation are driving investment away from the city at the exact moment it desperately needs economic growth. Critics warn that punishing successful businesses may satisfy political narratives in the short term while destroying the tax base that funds public services. Meanwhile, supporters of the mayor argue that the old economic model failed ordinary residents long ago. They point to luxury developments, widening inequality, and decades of rising rents as evidence that unrestricted capitalism left working-class communities behind. From their perspective, stronger regulation and government involvement are necessary corrections to a system that increasingly benefits only the wealthy. This ideological collision has transformed housing into something much larger than apartments and rent payments. It has become a battle over what kind of city people want New York to become. One vision prioritizes market expansion, development, investment, and competition. The other emphasizes protections, redistribution, and government oversight to guarantee affordability. Both sides claim they are fighting for survival, and neither appears willing to compromise. As political rhetoric intensifies, some residents fear the city is entering a dangerous period where economic decisions are being driven more by ideology than practicality. They argue that policies hostile toward construction and investment cannot coexist with demands for lower housing costs. If building becomes too expensive or too difficult, developers stop creating new housing entirely, leaving shortages to worsen year after year. Others reject that argument completely, insisting that developers have already profited enormously while ordinary people suffer. They believe stronger regulations are necessary to prevent exploitation and preserve communities being hollowed out by luxury development and speculative investment. To them, rising rents are proof that the market alone cannot solve the affordability crisis. The mayor has attempted to present himself as balancing both sides of the issue, acknowledging the pressures facing tenants and landlords alike. But critics remain skeptical, arguing that his administration consistently moves toward policies that expand government control over housing while discouraging private investment. They see every new regulation, tax increase, and public confrontation with business owners as evidence of a broader ideological transformation unfolding inside the city. Landlords continue warning that many buildings are already financially unstable. Taxes rise annually, insurance premiums have exploded, utility costs continue climbing, and maintenance expenses never stop increasing. Property owners argue that if rent increases fail to match these realities, they are effectively being asked to operate buildings at a loss indefinitely, something they claim no industry could survive. Tenants respond by asking a simple question. If landlords are struggling so badly, why are rents still unaffordable everywhere? That contradiction fuels enormous distrust. Many residents believe property owners exaggerate financial hardship while continuing to benefit from rising property values and housing scarcity. Landlords counter that revenues and profits are not the same thing, and that high rents do not automatically mean healthy finances when operating costs consume nearly everything. The deeper problem is that nobody trusts anybody anymore. Tenants distrust landlords, landlords distrust politicians, businesses distrust regulators, and voters increasingly distrust the promises made by elected officials. Every new proposal is viewed through a lens of suspicion, and every economic problem immediately becomes political ammunition for competing ideologies battling over the city's future. As the rent debate continues, many New Yorkers fear they are watching a slow transformation of the city itself. Rising costs are pushing middle-class families out, businesses are reconsidering their future, and younger residents increasingly wonder whether they will ever be able to afford stable housing at all. The anxiety is no longer limited to low-income communities. It is spreading across nearly every economic class.
Some longtime residents now openly question whether the city can sustain itself under its current direction. They see a government expanding control, while the private sector becomes increasingly frustrated and constrained. Others believe the only path forward is even stronger intervention to protect residents from economic forces they believe have already made the city unlivable for ordinary people. The outcome of this conflict could shape the future of New York for decades. If current policies continue, supporters believe the city may become more equitable and less dominated by wealth and speculation. Critics believe the opposite will happen, warning of shrinking investment, deteriorating housing, and permanent economic decline, masked temporarily by political messaging and government expansion.
For now, the battle lines are drawn. Protesters continue demanding frozen rents. Landlords warn buildings cannot survive without higher revenue. Politicians attempt to navigate the growing fury from both sides, while affordability keeps collapsing around them. And millions of residents are left wondering whether the city's housing crisis is being solved or whether it is spiraling into something far bigger that nobody will be able to stop once it fully arrives.